In this video, we're going to review the supplies and information we need to make sure we have together in order to be able to begin the 308 Winchester reloads. The load that we've selected is based on a very specific bullet. It's the Hornady 165 grain boat tail spire point, which is the equivalent to the non-boat tail spire point version of this, which we found in the Hodgdon manual. So we have the bullet selected. We have chosen the load from the two manuals based on the Varget powder and its velocities that were generated in both manuals, and we have two other components that we need to get together at this time. The first one is the primers, and if you look at the Hornady book in the beginning of the 308 Winchester section, it specifically tells you that they worked up their loads in a Winchester Model 70 rifle, interestingly enough, with a Federal 210 primer. Now, if you look at the Hodgdon book, the primer they selected was a 210M. Now, the M does not stand for Magnum. In the case of Federal, the 210M is the match version of their large rifle primer. The match versions of primers are generally manufactured to tighter tolerances for even more precision shooting than you would with a standard primer, but for all practical purposes, they're interchangeable here. Now, I don't happen to have the Federal primers on hand, but I do have the equivalent large rifle primer in CCI, which is their number 200. And as we've discussed in other videos, the primers can be substituted by brand only, but with two caveats. One caveat is that you are only interchanging the brand. For instance, in this instance, the standard large rifle primer of CCI for the standard large rifle primer of Federal. You're not substituting a Magnum for a standard. You're not substituting a rifle for pistol or pistol for rifle. The only thing you're substituting is the brand. That's one caveat. The second caveat is that you only should be doing these substitutions at starting loads. In this instance, the 2100 foot per second load in the Hornady manual with the Varget powder is where we're starting. It's okay to substitute primers by brand only at the starting loads and starting pressures. The reason for that's very simple. Testing of primers has shown that if you substitute brand only in any given cartridge, you can change the pressures that are generated upon combustion of the powder by anywhere from a few psi to several thousand psi. At starting loads, those types of pressure differentials are not a hazard or a risk. At worked up loads, they can be. If you have a load worked up to substantially higher than starting loads and starting pressures, and you suddenly increase the pressure by several thousand psi, you could inadvertently put yourself in a pressure range that you not only didn't anticipate being in, but one that could pose a particular problem. So we're going to substitute primers at our starting load. Once you're working up a load, the performance of the load is more dictating where you are and the safety of that load as opposed to the pressures that are generated, because you can't measure pressures, but you can measure velocities. And of course, at no point do you go over the published loads. The last component we need to get together is the brass. The 308 brass is extremely common because of the wide use of the 308 Winchester load. The only thing that you need to be careful about, and we'll go into this in more detail in the section specifically on the case prep, you have to make sure you don't have crimped primer pockets. The 308 or the equivalent 7.62 by 51 NATO has some military applications, and it's possible to have military brass that has crimps on them. You have to know that to avoid problems in the priming stages, because you'll have to remove that military crimp prior to priming. Now, as far as information goes, there's a couple of things we need to know. One of them is the overall maximum length of the case. Because we're dealing with rifle ammunition as opposed to pistol, it is a common phenomenon for the cases to elongate over repeated reloadings and firings, so you're going to want to know the maximum. The Federal book tells us the maximum is 2.015 inches, so we're going to need to be able to take that into consideration. The Hodgdon book does not give us a maximum overall length, but it does give us a minimum, which is the trim to length. In both books, they're the same at 2.005 inches. So that's the length we would trim to if our cases were too long. The last piece of information we need is the COL, or the cartridge overall length, which is the length from the base of the case to the tip of the bullet. If you look at the specific load we've selected in the bullet we've selected in the Hornady manual, the COL is 2.750 inches. Fortunately for both the boat tail and the standard spire point, because we've relied on the standard spire point in the Hodgdon manual, the lengths are the same and the COLs are the same. So we're good to go with 2.750 inches. And so that's the information that we need to have together. That's the supplies we have to have together. So we're going to begin with the next video, proceeding to the actual prepping of the brass and the reloading of these cartridges.